We didn't find a voice first. We found a screen. A scuffed little camera sat on the desk under the station's humming fluorescent light blinking awake after weeks in the snow. On that dim square, a line of tiny figures crossed a blade of ridge ropes, taut coats snapping in wind that you could almost hear through the glass. No names, just silhouettes in a world of white and the sense that whatever was coming had already started. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I've worked this mountain long enough to know it by smell and by sound. In July at Paradise, the air carries wet mineral and sun-softened pine, and the parking lot is a steady chorus of doors thumping shut, bear bells chiming, and folks calling out last-minute questions over the hiss of a Coleman stove. My mornings start before the cafe opens coffee from a big dented thermos logbook spread across a battered oak desk barometer needle. I still check even though the weather service says I don't have to. When it reads steady, my shoulders settle. When it dips, I feel it behind the eyes. That week was a steady read. The forecast looked kindly mid-40s at dawn at Paradise, climbing into the 60s on the asphalt, firm snow up high, and the kind of light breeze that turns flags into lazy ribbons. I made my rounds, checked the trailhead board, replaced a torn notice, turned a fallen orange cone upright. Tour buses sighed. Kids pressed noses to glass at a buck wandering the meadow. A day meant for blue skies and quiet victories. They stepped into that morning like it belonged to them. 9 of them boots clacking across the station's concrete ropes coiled neat around their torsos. Jordan Hale led the way with a polite nod. I've come to trust in mountain people confident, but with that small bend in the neck that says, we know where we are. He set his pack down just so edges aligned as if the mountain noticed those things. Beside him, Riley Harper checked her camera a final time and asked me what cold does to batteries. I told her what I tell everyone. Keep them close to heat when you can. Don't waste shots, and remember that sound travels strange in wind. Micah, our own on his day off, grinned like a man who loved seeing the place from the other side of the counter. He pointed at the permit form and teased me about my handwriting, said it looked like trail switchbacks. Nolan signed next, left-handed neat as a medic's note. Gavin shaded a tiny diagram of the disappointment cleaver on a napkin while they waited on their receipt he sketched with the kind of quiet that warms a room without saying a word. Theo slid in with a teacher's patience, balancing humor and focus. He called the climb a field trip with consequences and then apologized for the joke. Silas nearly knocked over the hand sanitizer with his elbow and caught it mid-air laughing at himself. Ronan's handshake told me he set beams for a living. Declan stood a half-step back, eyes moving over the maps on the wall like he was learning a script. They weren't strangers here. Most had climbed Rainier before. They spoke in the shorthand of people who've tested each other, who runs cold, who needs a nudge at 13,000 feet, who can find a safe line in Sastrugi without calling a meeting about it. Their gear told the same truth. Nothing brand new and shiny. Nothing worn past sense. I ask the basic questions because it's my job. They gave the answers in a way that made my pen move faster. Outside, the parking lot smelled like sunscreen and hot brake pads. A breeze came off the snowfield, cool at first, then soft as laundry steam where it met sunlit asphalt. The mountain wore its July face the summit like a clean coin you could almost touch, lenticular clouds nowhere to be seen. Ribbons of meltwater slipping through the meadow grasses. Folks at the trailhead traded snacks and last sips of coffee. A dad in a mariner's cap tried to get 3 teenagers to smile for a photo. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked twice at a crow and then gave up. I watched the 9 shoulder their packs and head toward the trail with the easy rhythm of people who'd practiced it in smaller ways. Boat ramps, moving days, weddings where chairs had to be put away before rain. They paused at the steps for a quick group count without even saying count. I wrote the time in the log. The page held steady under my hand. Maybe that's what I remember most about that morning, the feeling of everything lined up and true. We have a habit. Those of us who work here of measuring days in small events, a lost hat reunited with a grandmother, a hail squall that lasts 3 minutes and turns the boardwalk white, a couple from Ohio who drove straight through the night and fall asleep on a picnic table while their son photographs marmots. My afternoon plan was routine. Check radios, walk the first mile of the Skyline Trail, call the Snowfield Patrol and make sure the boundary wands were straight. Glance at the barometer again, even though it's not my job to worry a needle. The visitors center hummed cool air and a low chorus of voices. I remember a volunteer pointing out Mount Adams to a pair of retirees with a folded Chiltaway map, their fingers tracing the Cascades like a route they'd drive just for the joy of it. A kid dragged a plush mountain goat by the horn across the gift shop floor while his mom pretended not to see. Staff cut a sheet cake in the break room for a birthday, and the icing stained everyone's tongues a bright, improbable blue. The day felt glued together by simple things, thick things, nothing that would crack when you tapped it. I saw the 9 again just after lunch, a bright row up on the snowfield like confetti that forgot to fall. The sun bounced off them so hard that even with sunglasses I had to shade the lenses with my palm. They moved in a slow, steady line, spacing right ropes, set the way you like to see them enough slack to catch not so much that feet snag. Heels set poles planted no drama. A school group near me clapped like they were watching a parade. The mountain threw back a dry little gust and then went still again. Certain sounds make a ranger listen harder. A radio burst with no voice. A bird chorus that cuts off gravel that keeps rolling longer than it should. That afternoon, I didn't hear any of them. Instead, there were the ordinary notes, the sizzle of a grill at the lodge, a far-off cheer when a couple from Texas spotted the summit from the overlook, 2 snowboarders sliding down the last patch of stubborn slush, and immediately congratulating each other as if they'd crossed Alaska. I wrote a note to myself to replace a faded warning sign at the glacier edge, underlined it, folded the page and stuck it in my pocket. Jordan came by the permit desk one last time around 2, a quick walk-in before they headed higher. He didn't need anything. He just tapped 2 knuckles on the counter and nodded toward the windows. "Good day," he said. Not a question. Riley smiled the kind of smile people save for quiet shelves of memory. She held the camera at her side like a book she didn't want to dog-ear. I asked if they were checking in at Camp Muir the way we like them to. She said yes, and she said it the way you say seatbelt and one last light part of the rhythm of leaving. I might have noticed a change in the air if I hadn't been tugged into a separate errand. A family had locked their keys in the car, and the driver stood there with her hands on top of her head like she was balancing her own worry. We made a call, got them sorted. They thanked me like I'd given them back a year of life. That's the job, too, piecing small emergencies into the day, so bigger ones don't find room to grow. Late afternoon brought a hint, just a hint of high cloud, the thin kind that moves like milk across a blue pane. You don't read too much into that in July. Light wind lifted the flags. A bit of grit skittered along the concrete, whispered at the base of the big map outside the door, then settled again. If I'm honest, I remember seeing one of our meadow docents pause, look up toward the shoulder of the mountain as if she'd heard a name. It lasted 1 second. She went back to her group. So did I. The world before a break has a sound I can't describe to folks who haven't stood at 400 feet when the day gives itself back to evening. Car doors thump a little softer. Boots lose their clack and pick up a hush. The snowfield turns from white to gold to something like pewter, and the summit sets its long shadow across the Nisqually like a hand thrown across a bedspread. You wash your coffee mug and set it to dry on a folded paper towel. You loop the radio cord once so it won't kink overnight. You tell yourself you'll replace that faded sign first thing in the morning. Just before I headed home, a ranger from the upper snowfield checked in by radio short routine. Camp Muir reported some late-start climbers, bedding down early, nothing unusual. I took one more walk around the lot, touching each hood of the government rigs on habit, feeling the heat coming off them the way men from my father's generation touched the fender of a car to judge if it ran right. The air slid down from above like it always does, cold enough to pinch your cheeks, but not so cold you mind. Someone's porch light clicked on in Ashford right on schedule. We could see them from the station on a clear night, the road lights stepping down the valley like little saints. On my drive, I counted the deer by the ditch 3 and let the radio ride the low static of the night channel volume turned down so it wouldn't startle me if it popped. The sky over the ridge was clean and pale, and the back window of the truck gathered a thin mist I wiped away with the cuff of my sleeve at the gas station. Home smelled like cedar and clean laundry. My wife left a casserole under foil on the counter with a note, "Went to choir. See you after 8." The house made the settling sounds old wood makes when the evening slides in. I sat on the back steps and filled out the day's last entries with a stub pencil I keep in the pocket of my uniform shirt. Names, party size, expected route. I circled the 9 just a light circle to catch my eye in the morning and tucked the log into my bag. Somewhere up the valley a train went by far enough that you felt it more than you heard it, a long, low thread through the timber. The barometer in the hallway register ticked once so small a sound it could have been the house. I turned on the porch light because that's what we do out here when someone we care about is still on the road. Then I stood there longer than usual listening to a wind that didn't quite decide itself and watched the dark take the last shine off the mountain. The radio stayed quiet. The light stayed on. And the phone for a little while did not ring. That night, the porch light burned long after I should have turned in. I kept the radio on low, half hoping to hear chatter from Camp Muir before sleep claimed me. Nothing came. Just the wind moving through fir trees like the mountain clearing its throat. When I drove back up the next morning, the parking lot was washed in gold and the smell of cold diesel from early shuttle buses. The first thing I noticed was the air thin and restless, the kind that carries change but won't say what kind. Up on the ridge, Rainier wore a soft veil. Not a storm yet, but the sort of mist that sneaks in ahead of one. By mid-morning, families filled the visitor center again, same laughter, same small talk. But I couldn't shake a hitch in my chest. When you work a place long enough, you learn to trust those small alarms. I told myself the 9 were fine. They'd camped at Muir, seasoned climbers, probably halfway home by noon. But noon came and went. 1 o'clock. 2. My pencil tapped the logbook, the names circled from yesterday. By 3, the first whisper of worry brushed the station. A guide, checking his radio, said the upper air was thick with snow crystals blowing sideways. I called Muir for a check-in. Static. Tried again. More static. The storm hit faster than any forecast had promised. Within an hour, the mountain disappeared behind a sheet of white so dense it erased the horizon. You couldn't see 20 feet ahead. Helicopters grounded. Climbers pinned down. That's how it goes, 1 minute blue, the next a milk-colored wall swallowing everything that breathes. By late afternoon, we logged the 9 as delayed, not missing. A word that carries hope if you say it quiet enough. At 8 that night, 2 of their friends from the Seattle club came down from Camp Muir. They'd stayed behind when the others pushed for the summit. They looked weathered and small, their faces burned red and raw. They hadn't heard a word from the group since the morning before. I poured coffee, set the cups down, and they just stared past me at the map on the wall. They should have been back by now, one said. Jordan doesn't miss a check. That's when I knew it had crossed over from worry to fear. I radioed search coordination. The chief ranger, a man named Will Hart, came up from Ashford in his old Ford within the hour. He was quiet, like always. He looked out through the glass toward where the summit should have been. "We'll give it dawn," he said. "If they haven't called by first light, we move." I nodded. None of us slept much that night. I remember sitting by the radio, listening to static hiss like breathing through cloth and thinking about that little camera Riley carried. She'd shown it to me with such pride, said it was her first digital one. "You can see the photo right away," she'd said, smiling. I thought about that while the clock hands dragged across the face and the snow beat against the windows like sand. Morning came pale and harsh. The storm had chewed through everything, leaving drifts taller than the trucks. Helicopters thudded to life, their blades scattering fresh powder. From above, Rainier looked clean and cruel, no tracks, no color, just endless ice folds. I went up on the first flight. My stomach turned when we cleared the clouds and saw what the storm had done. The ridge where they'd last been spotted was torn open. Cornices sheared away, ropes of ice the size of houses peeled down into black crevasses. We sat down near Ingram Flats. The air stung sharp as metal. You couldn't speak without frost forming on your lips. Our search teams moved slow ropes tied in threes probes, punching into snow that might have been solid or hollow. We found a glove first, red half, buried, frozen, stiff. Then a trekking pole bent near the handle. No bodies, no clear line of descent, just scattered ghosts of gear. Down at the visitor center, families began to gather. I remember Riley's mother arriving that afternoon. She walked right past the front desk to the window where the peak should have been. Her hand touched the glass like she was feeling for heat that wasn't there. Days bled into each other. We searched from sunrise to dusk, cutting grids across the glacier, marking every piece of color we saw. A patch of nylon here, a torn strap there. Everything told a story we couldn't finish. People brought casseroles to the command tent. Volunteers came from Oregon, Idaho, even Alaska mountain folks who understood the call. Every evening we met to compare notes, and every evening the board stayed blank in the column marked status. After a week, the storm cycle returned. We had to pull back. The snow kept what it wanted. Still, I couldn't stop going up when the weather cleared. Some nights I'd drive to the pullout just below Paradise and sit there watching the clouds crawl around the summit headlights off engine ticking as it cooled. My wife called it stubbornness. I called it duty. Maybe it was both. By the third week, hope thinned the way breath does up high. The official search was scaled back, though we kept a skeleton crew running sweeps. Families refused to leave. They set up tents near the lot, pictures of the 9 taped to the ranger hut door. Candlelight flickered against the snowbank, like stars caught low to the ground. I tried to give them updates, but after a while, there was nothing left to say. Then October came. The air changed again, colder, quieter. Snow hardened into crust. We were marking avalanche paths when I spotted something glinting through the frost near a ridge of ice. At first I thought it was a lens cap. I dug with my glove chipped around the edge and felt the unmistakable square of a compact camera. Black, cracked, half frozen to the crust. My breath fogged the screen as I brushed the snow off the back. I could see the Olympus logo through scratches. It had to be Riley's. My pulse kicked up hard enough I could feel it in my ears. Back at the station, I set it on the desk under the fluorescent light, the one that hums like an old fridge. The casing was dented, but the compartment was dry. I slid out the memory card, the tiny plastic thing no bigger than a postage stamp, and handed it to our evidence tech, Lena Voss. She'd driven up from Tacoma that morning, sharp woman with a careful touch. She didn't say much, just nodded, fitted the card into her reader, and waited. The screen on her laptop came alive with thumbnails, hundreds of them. The room went quiet except for the fan whirring inside the machine. The first image was a shot of the 9 at the trailhead smiling, waving the sky so blue it hurt to look at. The next few showed the climb step after step until the snow gave way to that strange pale light near the top. Then the summit photos, arms, raised faces, red from wind and sun happiness, so clean it felt wrong to see it now. We scrolled further. The timestamps crept into afternoon. 3:40 p.m., 3:45. The images grew blurry, snow streaking across the frame. One short clip opened with heavy breathing wind hammering the microphone figures leaning into ropes. Jordan's voice, faint but steady, called a command to tighten the line. A flash of someone slipping a curse lost to static. Then a hand Declan's we'd learn later fumbling with something shiny near his harness. The screen jolted, twisted sideways, then went black. Lena stopped the playback and exhaled. She looked at me, and I could see her weighing what to say. "This isn't just weather," she murmured. We played it again, slower, this time frame by frame. What I'd thought was a tool strap looked like a blade. The movement wasn't random, it was deliberate, sharp cutting downward. The rope snapped taut in the next instant, and one figure fell out of view. The sound god. The sound was a single scream swallowed by wind. Then silence. For a long time, no one spoke. The only noise was the click of the heater and the mountain's wind sneaking through the vent. When I finally found my voice, it came out rough. "Could it have been an accident?" I asked. Lena didn't answer right away. She zoomed in until pixels turned to squares of color. Maybe she said softly, or maybe panic. She rewound to a few seconds before the cut and boosted the audio. Between gusts, a voice surfaced, male shaking. "Can't hold. Sorry." It was enough to change everything we thought we knew. The discovery spread fast. Within hours, the command center filled with brass investigators, even a reporter or two who'd heard whispers. We sealed the footage, logged it under evidence, and started mapping where the rope could have failed. The families were told only that we'd found new material, nothing more. I didn't have the heart to say what I'd seen. Not yet. That night I drove home under a sky full of low clouds that never broke. The wipers squeaked against a dry windshield most of the way. I kept thinking about that frame, the gloved hand, the knife edge catching the faint light. I told myself it was reflex, a desperate move to free a jammed line. But another part of me, the part that's seen too many strange decisions made in thin air, wasn't so sure. A week later, we took the footage to a forensic lab in Seattle. They confirmed what Lena suspected: the cut came from the main rope, not an auxiliary loop. A clean slice, consistent with a single downward motion. It wasn't weather that separated them. It was a choice. Whether born of fear madness or something darker, we didn't know. I went back up to Rainier soon after, to the ridge where we'd found the camera. The light was fading, a pale gold washing the glacier's face. The wind had calmed. I stood there listening to the mountain breathe, thinking of 9 people laughing their way into the clouds and how quick laughter can turn to silence. I knew we'd only begun to understand what happened up there, but the camera had spoken once, and mountains have a way of keeping the rest. When I headed down, dusk slid through the trees like smoke. The radio crackled once, faint and empty. I switched it off and let the quiet take over. Somewhere above, buried deep under layers of snow, more answers waited sealed in ice. And though the world below had moved on, the mountain wasn't done with us yet. I didn't sleep much after the camera footage came in. Every time I closed my eyes, that image returned: the gloved hand, the cut, the line going slack. The mind plays it back in pieces, changing angles it never saw, trying to make sense of something that won't explain itself. By the time dawn slipped through my blinds, I knew I'd drive back up the mountain. Not because I was assigned to, but because I couldn't stand being away from it. When I got to the ranger station, Lena was already there, hunched over the same laptop, her fingers tracing frozen frames like she was touching ghosts. She looked up when I walked in, eyes ringed dark from no sleep. "There's more," she said quietly. She had slowed the footage again, pulling faint audio out from the static. Between gusts of wind, we could hear shouts, short-clipped and panicked. Jordan calling for the rope team, someone crying out a name. Then silence that stretched too long to be weather. The camera cut there, but the memory card held dozens of stills afterward, frozen moments the device kept recording until its power died. Snow patterns, blurred shadows, maybe movement. maybe not. We spent that whole morning listening, staring, arguing over inches of film. Could Declan have meant to sever the main line, or had he just been trying to free a tangle? It's a question that sounds simple until you've watched people die on a mountain. Panic looks an awful lot like intent when you slow it down. Lena kept replaying one section, zooming until it became a mosaic of pixels. She pointed at a sliver of metal near his glove, a reflection bending away from the rope. "That's not a fray," she said. "It's a slice." I didn't answer. The word sat there between us heavier than anything else in the room. The footage changed everything. Within 24 hours, investigators from the Park Service and the state came in with boxes, recorders, even a small forensic team out of Tacoma. They treated the camera like a body, gloves, evidence bags chain of custody. Families were called back to headquarters, told there'd been a development, but no one said what kind. I watched them file in through the glass door that afternoon. Mothers, fathers, siblings, people who had memorized the smell of borrowed climbing jackets now hung forever in closets. They looked at us like we were supposed to hand them certainty, but all we had was a handful of pictures and the worst kind of question. As the days went on, we started piecing the timeline together. The group had reached the summit near 2 in the afternoon, just as the weather started shifting. Satellite data confirmed a sudden microburst winds doubling in under 15 minutes, visibility collapsing to near zero. They were descending the Ingraham route when the first slip happened somewhere around 13,000 feet. Riley's footage caught the chaos that followed, then darkness. It should have ended there, but Lena found something buried deeper in the file directory, a corrupted audio log the camera had kept recording after being dropped. No video this time, just sound, snow grinding under boots. Wind clawing at fabric, muffled voices close to the mic. The first clear words were Micah's. "He cut it." "You cut it." Then Declan's panicked. "It frayed. I swear." What came next sounded like a scuffle, grunts, rope scraping ice, and then a thud that made Lena flinch when she played it through the speakers. Someone gasped. Maybe Riley, then silence. That single recording turned rumor into suspicion. Investigators began looking at Declan's background. He wasn't the friend the others had grown up with. He'd joined their climbing group only a year before. A salesman from Tacoma, divorced recently, known to chase high-dollar hobbies. We learned about a new life insurance policy he'd taken out 2 weeks before the climb, $500,000 with his sister listed as beneficiary. It could have been coincidence, but in cases like this, coincidence never feels clean. I remember standing out by the lot as news of the footage leaked the mountain behind me so clear it almost seemed to deny what had happened. A local paper ran a headline calling it Rainier's Betrayal. I hated that phrase, but I couldn't shake it either. When I looked at the faces in those photos, smiling arms slung around shoulders, I kept wondering if any of them had sensed what was coming, if anyone had felt something shift in Declan that last hour. It's the kind of question that sticks to you even when you know you'll never get the answer right. Winter set in early that year, hard and unforgiving. The official search had ended, but I still went up with the small teams clearing trails or checking avalanche markers. The mountain changes shape with each snowfall, hiding and revealing in turns. We'd find pieces now and then, a section of rope fused into ice, a carabiner scuffed smooth once, even a crushed thermos with initials scratched on the bottom, NP for Nolan Pierce. Every find went into storage, cataloged, logged, and photographed. But no bodies, not until spring. In March of the next year, when the snow softened enough to move, we went back with full crews. Dogs, probes, GPS lines marking the known crevasse fields. I was with the team that uncovered Micah Reed first. He was found curled near an ice wall rope, still cinched around his waist, ice axe locked in one hand like he'd been trying to climb back out. Not far from him, we found Nolan's med kit scattered across a drift, torn open vials, frozen solid. From what the coroner later said, they'd both died of exposure within hours, maybe less. That knowledge brings no comfort. It just adds shape to the emptiness. Each recovery drew the families back to paradise. They'd line up quietly near the observation deck while we brought down the remains wrapped in tarp, lowered into the waiting trucks. No one said much, just the soft sounds of crying against the wind. I kept thinking of Riley's father. He never spoke, only stood with a folded piece of paper in his pocket, rubbing the corner down until it shredded. After one recovery, he turned to me and asked, almost gently, "You think she knew I told him the truth?" I didn't know. Lena kept combing through the evidence that spring, and by May she had found more fragments of Declan's trail. A secondary camera bag turned up about 300 yards from where the first footage had been recorded. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film from another climber, Theo's, it turned out. The negatives showed the group on the ridge just before the storm. In one frame, faint and blurred by wind, was Declan moving downhill alone, his back to the others. You could see the angle of his shoulder, the direction of his gait, deliberate, not lost. When Lena showed it to me, she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. In early June, a tip came in from a man named Ezra, a retired logger who worked summers as a trail guide. He swore he'd seen someone near Paradise in late July the previous year, a man limping, wearing a torn red jacket, muttering to himself before disappearing into the woods. He hadn't thought much of it until he saw Declan's picture on the news. The description matched too closely to ignore. A few days later, we traced one of Declan's credit card charges to a gas station 50 miles west in Enumclaw, dated July 20th, 5 days after the climb. That was the moment I felt my stomach drop. He'd made it down. I'd like to say that discovery brought relief, but it didn't. It changed the shape of grief into something colder. The others hadn't just died in a storm, they'd been left there. Declan had walked off the mountain alive, carrying the weight of that rope in his mind, and never said a word. We started searching again this time, not for victims, but for a fugitive. I coordinated the teams across the lower valleys, working with county deputies who combed through logging roads and hunting cabins. What we found instead were traces, boot prints in mud, hardened by summer heat, the torn remains of a sleeping bag, a protein bar wrapper buried under pine needles. DNA later confirmed what we already feared: Declan had been there. By July, the public wanted blood. Reporters camped outside the ranger station, shouting questions over the wind. They wanted motive confession closure. But all we had were fragments and silence. Even now, I think about that word he muttered in the video, sorry, and how it could mean anything when you're facing a wall of white. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he saw a way out that didn't include the others. Fear makes strange bargains with conscience when the air runs thin. The last time I climbed up that ridge before winter closed it again, I stopped at the spot where we'd first found the camera. The snow had melted back to rock gray and veined with frozen runoff. I knelt down and pressed my glove against the stone. It was cold, of course, but not dead. You could feel the faint vibration of water beneath it, the slow pulse of melt traveling through the mountain's veins. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone quiet. On my way down, I caught sight of a shape in the distance, a dark patch where ice had given way to soil. It could have been anything. A shadow, a stump the trick of light on thawing ground. But it drew me back the next morning. We probed the area carefully, cutting through crust until the tip of my pole struck something solid. When we cleared it, it turned out to be the corner of a torn jacket, red like the one Ezra had described. Inside the pocket was a cracked GPS device and a folded scrap of paper, its ink almost gone. Only 2 words could still be read. Too heavy. That was the last thing I found before the snow came again, covering everything like the mountain's own verdict. I bagged the note, logged the coordinates, and started back toward base. The wind had picked up, whispering low against the ice. I remember thinking it sounded like breathing slow, shallow, and restless, as if the mountain itself hadn't finished telling the story. And deep down I knew it hadn't. Spring came late that year, slow and reluctant, as if the mountain didn't want to let go of what it was hiding. I remember the first melt vividly, the sound of water running under the snowpack like veins thawing after a long freeze. Every ranger who'd lived through winters up here knew that sound meant work. Avalanches would break loose, crevasses would open again, and if you were patient enough, the mountain might finally give back what it had taken. I'd been on Rainier for more than 20 years, but I'd never felt the kind of weight that season carried. The camera, the footage, the red jacket we'd found, all of it pointed to something darker than bad luck. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe somewhere out there beneath the thawing ice, the rest of the truth was waiting. We started early in April. The search plan looked more like a military operation than a rescue grids mapped by GPS teams working ropes and avalanche probes dogs flown in from Colorado. I led one of the ground groups near Ingraham Glacier, the same ridge where we'd found the Olympus months before. Every step was deliberate. Even breathing felt heavier that high up. You could hear the groan of shifting snow beneath your boots, that deep sound that reminds you the ground isn't solid. Not really. We worked in silence most of the time. Talking out there feels like arguing in a church. On the 10th day we found Micah. It was one of the handlers who spotted him first, a shape under a thin crust of ice near a shallow crevasse. I helped dig him out. He was curled up on his side, his ice axe locked in his hand rope still looped around his waist. There was something almost peaceful about the way he'd settled, as if he'd just lain down to rest, and the cold had come too quickly. Nearby, we found Nolan's med kit, the same one he always carried clipped to his belt. The zipper had frozen halfway open, and inside the vials had cracked from the cold. That told us what we needed to know. He'd been trying to help someone even in that storm. We sent word to base, and by afternoon the helicopters were coming in small specks moving through the thin air. The families had been waiting at Paradise since sunrise. I saw Riley's father standing near the barrier coat zipped up to his throat, hands tucked into his sleeves. He didn't cry when we told him. None of them did. It's strange how quiet grief can be when it's expected. I drove back down the mountain that night with my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. The truck heater couldn't keep up, and for the whole drive I thought about Micah's axe, how tightly he'd held on to it like he'd known he'd need to anchor himself against something even if it wasn't enough. The recoveries came in slow after that. Pieces of equipment, fragments of clothing, and occasional boot print frozen in runoff that melted before we could cast it. Each find was another piece of the puzzle, and each one pointed in the same direction Declan had made it off that mountain alive. The idea burned through the team like kerosene. Some called it impossible. Others didn't. I'd been a ranger long enough to know that desperation can make men do unthinkable things. By May, the investigation had officially shifted from recovery to pursuit. Lena was the one who pushed it forward. She had spent months dissecting every second of that camera footage, every audio blip, every frame. One afternoon, she called me into the office and played a segment I hadn't heard before. It was faint, just a whisper, buried under the wind. You could hear Riley's voice, strained, scared, saying his name. Declan? No. Then a metallic click like a carabiner, or maybe a knife folding shut. The recording ended there. She looked at me across the desk. That wasn't panic, she said quietly. That was choice. Not long after a local hiker stumbled across something near the lower glacier, a second camera bag strap torn wedged in ice melt. Inside were rolls of undeveloped film from Theo's gear. We processed them at the field lab in Tacoma, and there it was, again, Declan visible in one frame walking downhill alone. His back turned, his face hidden by the hood of that red jacket. You could see where the others had been just minutes before, their tracks still crisp. That image did more damage to the families than any report ever could. They'd wanted to believe that everyone had died together, that there'd been no betrayal in their final hours. Now they had to imagine their children, their siblings, calling after a man who just kept walking. A week later, a tip came in from a retired logger named Ezra Clean. He swore he'd seen a man wandering near the Paradise lot the week after the storm, limping wild-eyed, wearing a tattered red jacket. Said he talked to himself, kept glancing over his shoulder like he was being followed. Ezra had shrugged it off at the time. He'd seen plenty of lost climbers before, but the news had stirred something. His description fit Declan perfectly. I went to see him myself. Ezra lived alone in a cabin near Ashford, a wood stove roaring even in summer. He didn't embellish the story. He just said that man looked hollow, like the mountain had spit him out, and he wasn't sure he deserved it. We pulled Declan's financials again and found what we'd missed. A gas receipt from Enumclaw dated July 20th, 5 days after the climb. He'd bought $40 of fuel and a bottle of water. The card was his. I remember staring at the timestamp on that slip, 8:12 p.m., and realizing he'd been alive, probably driving away from Rainier while we were still combing the ridge for bodies. The next week, we found boot prints in a ravine not far from where Ezra claimed to have seen him. The prints matched the size and tread of Declan's hiking boots. DNA from a torn sleeping bag nearby sealed it. He'd been hiding out in the woods for weeks before moving on. News spread fast. By July, the headlines read like a script out of a bad thriller: "Climber cuts rope, escapes alone." The families were torn apart by it. Some clung to the idea that Declan had lost his mind up there, that the altitude had driven him past reason. Others saw it as murder. I saw it as both. Mountains don't make monsters, but they sure know how to find them. We kept following his trail across the Cascades. A fisherman spotted a man in a red jacket near the White River, limping, talking to himself, then vanishing into the tree line. A week later, a blood-stained bandage turned up at a campground in Gifford Pinchot Forest. The DNA matched. He was hurt badly enough that he wouldn't have gone far, but still moving. Every new clue painted a picture of a man unraveling, running from both the mountain and himself. We checked every cabin, every ranger hut, every logging road. At night, I'd sit in the truck with the engine off, listening to the forest breathe, half expecting to hear him whisper back from the dark. By the time the leaves turned again, we knew he couldn't survive another winter out there. Either he'd come in, or the mountain would finish what it started. Still, part of me couldn't let it go. I'd been on this case too long, watched too many families break open under the weight of uncertainty. So when the call came the following April, I drove up myself. A snowmobiler had found an old shack north of Mount Adams' half-collapsed door, hanging by one hinge. Inside was a body slumped against the wall, a revolver still clutched in his hand. I don't know what I expected to feel walking into that shack, anger, maybe relief, but all I felt was the quiet. The air was still stale heavy with the smell of rust and pine smoke. His jacket was faded to brown, his beard long and matted. He'd been dead for weeks. The gunshot wound told the story before we even found the journal beside him. A small notebook, waterlogged but legible. I read the first line where I stood, made it down, cut the rope, had to. Too heavy. Sorry. I sat there for a long time, the wind slipping through the cracks in the boards. Declan had written almost every day from July of 2003 until March of 2005. The entries started with directions, streams, crossed shelters, found plans to collect the insurance once enough time had passed. But as the pages went on, the handwriting changed. Lines, slanted words, bled into each other. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing faces in the snow, about Riley calling his name at night. The last page read, "Can't run anymore. The mountain knows." We bagged the journal and took him out that evening. The sun was setting behind the ridgeline, lighting the trees with that copper glow you only get in the Cascades. I remember watching the stretcher rise into the helicopter and feeling a strange kind of sorrow, not for him, but for the quiet that would follow. When you chase a ghost long enough, catching it feels like losing something too. Back at the station, Lena processed the last of the evidence. The handwriting matched the insurance documents, the confession matched the footage, and the revolver had his prints. Officially, the case closed as manslaughter by negligence and suicide. Unofficially, it left a hole that will never be filled. Riley's body was never recovered. The glacier keeps its own timeline, and every year it shifts a little, erasing and revealing in equal measure. Sometimes climbers still find fragments, an old carabiner, a faded scrap of nylon, and they bring them down to the ranger desk like offerings. I kept one small thing from that shack, a photo found under the cot edges curled from damp. It was the summit picture, all 9 of them together, whined in their faces, grinning like they'd beaten the world. I never turned it in. I keep it in the bottom drawer of my desk, not out of disobedience, but because it reminds me that for a few hours on July 15th, before fear and hunger and snow stripped them down to their worst selves, they were still a family tied to the same rope. Sometimes I drive past the trailhead just after dusk, headlights catching the wooden sign half buried in frost. The snow has a way of softening everything up there, like mercy made visible. But I can never quite forget that under all that quiet beauty lies a truth as sharp as the knife that started it all. And somewhere beneath that ice, maybe even now, the last of her waits to be found. The mountain got quiet again after the case closed. The snow came early that year, blanketing the upper ridges before September had even finished. When I drove up one last time, the road was slick with frost, and the wind off the glacier had that hollow sound. It gets right before winter locks the place down. I parked near the overlook where you can see the whole south face on a clear day, but the summit was already swallowed in fog. It felt fitting. Some stories just don't end in sunlight. After we brought Declan down, the news burned hot for a few weeks. Headlines, interviews, opinion pieces about greed and survival, but it didn't take long for the noise to fade. That's how it usually goes. The families went home, the footage was sealed, and the park returned to its rhythm of permits and trail reports as if the ground hadn't held 9 souls only 2 years before. I stayed on a while longer, mostly to help with the aftermath. The statements, the recovery coordination, the endless paperwork that tries to make tragedy look like procedure. But even after the ink dried, something about this one lingered. You can work a lifetime around mountains and still not understand the kind of silence they keep. The remains we'd found were laid to rest that summer. 6 in total. Micah Nolan, Ronan, Theo, Silas, and Gavin. The service was held at the base lodge where families and rangers stood shoulder to shoulder under gray skies that never broke. Riley's father spoke last. He didn't talk about her death, only about the way she'd lived, how she'd wake before dawn to chase light for her photographs, how she believed mountains were sacred because they remind us how small we are. He said he still left her porch light on some nights, just in case she was finding her way home. No one moved when he finished. I don't think a single person there breathed until the wind came down off the ridge and carried the sound of the bell they rang for each name. Declan's journal became evidence for a few months, then a file number. The insurance company closed its case and his family arranged a quiet burial in Tacoma. No one from the climbing group attended and no one blamed them. His sister, who'd been listed as the beneficiary, turned the policy over to the victims' families. That money went into a memorial fund that still helps pay for rescue operations on the mountain. It's a strange kind of grace born out of something cruel, but maybe that's all redemption really is, someone trying to make right what can't be fixed. Lena left the bureau the following year. She told me she'd seen enough of death trapped inside memory cards. Before she packed up, she handed me one of the stills she'd restored, the last clear image of the group together on the summit, their faces half covered in scarves, eyes squinting against the glare. It's the same photograph I keep in my desk now, beside a folded topo map of the Ingraham Glacier. Sometimes I take it out when the weather report calls for heavy snow. There's something about those faces that still looks alive, like they're only seconds away from laughter. For the families, the mountain never really gave closure. Every thaw, it shifts a little, melts, a little exhales, what it held too long. 2 years after the investigation ended, a climber found Riley's locket at the mouth of a melt tunnel, tarnished the hinge still working. Inside were 2 small photos, one of her and Jordan, the other of her mother. That was the first thing of hers they'd recovered. Her parents came up that weekend to see the spot. We stood together near the ridge, the sun breaking just enough to show the top of the crater rim. Her father didn't say a word. He just knelt down, pressed his hand into the snow, and whispered something only the mountain could hear. I've carried that image with me ever since. The memorial came the following summer. The park approved a bronze plaque set into a stone near the trailhead. 9 names, no mention of how they died. Only the inscription, bound by rope, remembered by light. I still stop by it every season when the new climbers come through for permits. Some of them run their fingers over the metal before heading up, though they don't always know why. Maybe they just sense that the ground there remembers. I left full-time duty 2 years after that. 22 years in the service was enough. I still consult when the snowpack gets dangerous or a case goes cold, but mostly I spend my time down in Ashford fixing up an old cabin and tending a garden that never quite cooperates with the rain. On quiet mornings, I can still see the mountain from my porch, a faint outline behind the clouds. There are days when it looks peaceful, like a giant asleep. Other days when the wind picks up and the sky turns that color between silver and ash, it feels like it's watching. People ask sometimes what lesson I took from it all, what I learned after seeing that kind of betrayal in a place built on trust. I never have an easy answer. Some say the mountain brings out the worst in people. I think it just shows what's already there. You can't hide from yourself when there's nothing but air and ice around you. For most of them, that climb was supposed to be a celebration, an act of love, of friendship, of future. Somewhere along the way, fear turned that rope into a weapon. That thought keeps me humble every time I tie a knot. There's a new generation of rangers up there now, bright, eager, fearless, in that way you are before life gives you reason not to be. I stop by the station sometimes, and they still ask about that year. They want to know if the stories are true about the footage, the journal, the man who walked away. I tell them the parts they need to hear and leave out the rest. Some truths belong to the dead. Others just sit in the air waiting for someone to listen closely enough. Last winter I got a letter from Gavin Lockwood's sister. She said she'd taken up climbing again after nearly 20 years away from it. Her first ascent back was at Rainier. She told me she reached Camp Muir at sunrise, stood where her brother had once stood, and felt peace for the first time since losing him. She wrote, "It's not forgiveness, not really. It's just understanding that the mountain didn't choose who to take. It just waited." I read that line a dozen times before I folded the letter and put it in the same drawer as the photograph. When you work around death long enough, you start to realize closure isn't an event, it's a rhythm. It comes and goes like weather. You think you've made peace, and then a scent, a sound, a certain angle of light opens the door again. Sometimes I'll be driving past the park gate at dusk and I'll catch a glimpse of the ridge where we found the camera. For just a second, the light hits the ice in a way that makes it shimmer like glass. That's when I think about the 9 of them laughing, shouting over the wind, climbing towards something they believed was worth it. Maybe that's how they should be remembered. Not for how it ended, but for how alive they were the moment before. I still visit the memorial every July. I bring a small bouquet of wildflowers from the Valley Lupine paintbrush and the white ones whose names I can never remember. I set them on the stone and trace each letter of their names until the cold from the metal seeps into my fingertips. Then I step back, let the wind take what it will, and listen to the mountain breathe. It's been over 20 years now, and sometimes when a storm rolls in just right, I swear I can hear faint voices in the wind, laughter, a camera shutter, maybe nothing at all. Just the sound of memory keeping its own kind of weather. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or numbers, but so their names don't vanish into the dark. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, And if you've ever stood somewhere quiet and felt the world remembering, then you already understand why I can't stop telling this one.